Everybody that's across the Atlantic. We provide actionable insight on geopolitics at the intersection of capital markets. Today, I'm joined by Phil Hodge of Pinecliff Energy. Phil joined Pinecliff as the company's first employee in January 2012 as president, chief executive officer, and director. Mr. Hodge most recently held the positions of vice president, business development, and vice president, acquisitions and investments at Penn West Exploration, one of the largest oil and natural gas, producers in North America. Prior to that, Mr. Hodge was a managing director at Mackie Research Capital Corporation and J.F. Mackie Co, Calgary-based investment banks. From 2000 to 2006, Mr. Hodge was vice president and general counsel of Westport Innovations, Inc., where he was responsible for legal, corporate governance, strategic partnership, and corporate development functions, as well as the formation and growth of the company's business in China. Prior to 2000, Mr. Hodge was a partner at Bennett Jones LLP, a Canadian national law firm practicing in that firm's securities and mergers and acquisitions teams in its Calgary office. Phil, thank you so much for hopping on with me this morning. That was a lot, so if I missed anything, please feel free to correct me or add anything there, but really appreciate you hopping on this morning. And I know you're up in Canada and there's a bit of a time difference, perhaps, maybe not, but really appreciate the time.
Thanks for the invitation, Garrett. Looking forward to it.
Fantastic. So to set the scene and to do a bit of context setting here, Phil, you and I both live in the world of energy. In fact, you and I both met in Denver at an energy conference, EnerCom. And I think a lot of folks, particularly Americans, particularly young Americans, are maybe perhaps naive to the fact of, where do we get our energy, both in the United States and maybe even Canada. I'm a little less versed up there. But when we talk about oil and natural gas, I think that there's a lot of dynamics that folks don't understand. And to set the scene here a little bit, in 2023, just to throw out a stat, the United States was the largest exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas. I think quickly after that, it's the Qataris in Qatar, of course. We're talking about energy, where we actually get our sources of energy. Why has LNG, liquefied natural gas, exploded in popularity across the globe and as a demand and source of energy? What are these driving factors that are pushing this why in the demand of growth? And specifically, and I don't want to, bury the lead too much here, what regions around the world is this demand occurring in?
Yeah, no, you're right on a couple of observations you made there. I think the average North American would have very little idea as to where their energy comes from and what role natural gas and LNG play in kind of the economy. Your comment about the United States now being the largest LNG exporter in the world is pretty amazing. What the U.S. has done out of the Gulf of Mexico over the last 8 years. I mean, it was in 2016. There was no LNG exports, and for those of you that start from ground level, I mean, so all LNG is that it's liquefied natural gas. So they cool it to minus 160 degrees. And at that level, the gas turns into a liquid, and therefore they can put a lot more in it for transportation, like 600 times as much for transportation. So it allows it then to be sent on tankers. And I think, so there's a couple things. Natural gas, we're very fortunate in North America that we have a lot of natural gas. So the United States is the number one natural gas producer in all the world, by quite a bit. And then Canada is like fourth, fifth in the world in natural gas production. For sure. So between the two countries, we are huge natural gas producers on a global scale. What's changed in the last few years is that we are now exporting a lot of it. We used a lot of it domestically, but goes to your question. The world is clamoring, desperately wanting more natural gas. And the reason for that is that they're trying to get off of much more carbon intensive energy solutions, primarily coal, but also wood in many of the areas of Africa and Asia. And that's, the biggest growth in import demand has really been Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. These are the regions that use the most LNG imports. Now, since the war broke out with Russia and Ukraine, that since that invasion happened and the Nord Stream pipelines, Europe now needs a lot more LNG than they did before because they used to rely on Russian natural gas. So the political dynamics are changing rapidly in the world. But I think what the short, what it kind of comes back to is what you touched on. North America is in a very prime position here to be a supplier of natural gas and LNG globally. And I think LNG it's growing so fast that there was a prediction by a recent a stat that I put in my email that there'll be more LNG tankers on the water in 2030 than there will be oil tankers.
That's crazy. Yeah. And for those that don't know, and I always think that this is such an amazing feat of just think shipbuilding and everything. The LNG tankers are those really big ones with the round domes on them. Huge pieces of shipbuilding and assets. So I mean that's crazy, especially on the 2030 stat. Now, Phil, I'm curious. So you mentioned Asia, you mentioned China, you mentioned a few countries in that region specifically, and I even believe going through the bio. You spent time building up that firm's practice in China. So is it just a desire coming from these countries to burn lower carbon emission fuel, or is it something else? Is it more of an energy security stance? I'm just curious. I think maybe not pushback, but I'd be curious to see your thoughts and hear your thoughts if this is truly just not companies, countries chasing a lower emission profile for themselves, or if it's more centered around national security geopolitics, perhaps.
Yeah, it tends to be a variety of factors, and which factors are most prominent depends on which jurisdiction you're talking about. But there's no doubt that if natural gas is being sourced out of North America, that in many for the Western world, that's a more palatable and more from a political standpoint, something that they would covet much more than getting natural gas out of Russia, for instance. And Russia's the largest natural gas reserves in the world are in Russia. So the fact that Russia now is, under a lot of sanctions from a global perspective, it is making people look elsewhere. I've been to China over 40 times. There's no doubt that their move to natural gas was very much driven by pollution concerns. So their cities, especially Beijing and Shanghai, and many of the other large cities, pollution was very much an issue, and that had a large degree with the coal that was being used in the cities, much of which has been moved outside the cities now, so that they can use natural gas for industrial use. And they're now, China's leading the way in using natural gas and LNG for transportation. They're putting into heavy duty trucks more than any. So there's a variety of factors. I think India has been very clear that they, now the most populous country in the world, that they want to drastically increase their use of natural gas again because it's clean. Now they're still going to, they need still needs to be from secure sources. It also needs to be inexpensive to as much as possible. And many of the alternative energy sources like nuclear or wind and solar are not as inexpensive as natural gas is. So it's a variety of reasons.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, you bringing up price is a really big piece here. I think that also kind of dovetails, we don't have to get into it, but with the energy security piece, right? Because if you don't have if you have high prices, it's hard to supply a stable and steady stream of energy to the population, whatever country you're in.
Yeah, and I think that just to reflect on that, Garrett, I think again, many of your listeners may not be aware of when they talk about natural gas price. There's often a confusion with natural gas and gasoline prices. They're distinct. Just to give you a sense, when the Russian invasion happened in Ukraine, natural gas prices in Europe went to $90 an MCF. Right now, the prices in North America are around $2 an MCF. So there's this drastic chance for arbitrage. Today, the landed price for natural gas in Asia is around $10 to $12, which is about the same as for Europe. So there's a real economic incentive to be able to move natural gas from regions of where it's a surplus, like in North America, to areas that desperately need it.
Yeah. No, 100%. That's fantastic. And I think you bring up a good point, and this dovetails into our next piece here, Phil. So I'm curious, Now we're talking about North America, we're talking about Canada, we're talking about the United States, where there's obviously plentiful supply, and obviously we're doing a lot of exporting on the continent. Now, what are your thoughts, Phil, on the differences in nat gas production capacity as it stands currently today in Canada and the U.S.? And as I understand it, and I think you and I both know pretty well, the pictures are a bit different. So if you could just help explain what that production looks like in Canada of nat gas and what that production looks like in the United States. And we already talked about this a little bit, but what do you believe that's expected to look like as we head to 2030?
Yeah, it's really quite dynamic and changing. The United States now is about 100 BCF a day of natural gas production. And that's grown drastically over 15, 17 years ago, it was around half that. So we've had huge growth in natural gas production. And it's been primarily out of the shales. So there's the shales is a from a geological standpoint, we've been able to access these shales by using these very deep horizontal wells. And so there was a time when the United States thought they were going to be short natural gas and was actually building LNG import terminals. And then the shales were discovered with this new technology. And they now, just to give again that 100 BCF a day, the United States exports about 20 BCF a day. So they produce about 100, they export about 20. 14 of that is through LNG, and the other 6 is through pipeline to Mexico. At the same time, they're also importing about 7 or 8 BCF a day from Canada by pipeline. So,
Right.
Net, it's kind of like 113. Canada is on a much smaller scale. Canada is only about 18 BCF a day of production here in Canada, of which we send about 7 or 8 down to the United States. What's changing on the LNG side? So I mentioned the 14 BCF a day that's of LNG exports out of the United States.
Yeah.
What's changing in North America is that Canada is going to start exporting LNG next year, as is Mexico, which is ironic given that Mexico's importing natural gas from the United States, but they are going to start to export LNG, as is Canada. So the very first terminal in Canada is about 2 BCF a day. Well, that's over 10% of all the production in Canada. So even though there'll be more 2 BCF a day facilities coming on in the Gulf of Mexico and the United States, it doesn't have as large an impact. It's still positive, obviously, because there's more demand, but it won't be the same degree of impact that Canada is going to have.
Yeah. Now, I think this is interesting. So we talked about where the demand is coming from. You mentioned Europe. You also mentioned largely coming from Asia as well.
Right.
We're also talking about export terminals happening in Mexico and Canada. Phil, where are we building those export facilities? Are we building that in Mexico on the West Coast? Are we building them in Canada on the West Coast, or are these more East Coast facing, maybe perhaps to supply Europe?
Yeah, the one thing that the Mexico and Canada, they're both on the west coast of the continent, and that is a huge geographic advantage compared to the Gulf of Mexico, because the biggest markets, as we discussed, are in Asia. And so you're talking about 10 days of shipping time off the west coast of North America versus 24 days of shipping time out of the Gulf of Mexico. And so, U.S. could do the same thing. It's just that they have not been able to get LNG export terminals approved in California, Washington, or Oregon. And there's been attempts over the years. But so in the meantime, the British Columbia, which is the Canada's most western province, that's where the LNG export terminals are being built. And then you got the Baja Peninsula is where the Mexico export terminals are being built. So they're being built on that very strategically to take advantage of the fact that they will have much less shipping time, which means less emissions. And it also is it's more economical because the ships that you're renting for these projects aren't going to be on the water as much as they are from other ports.
Yeah. So it sounds like most of what's being produced in North America is being, focused and centered to head to Asia, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And so that's the picture now. What does that look like towards 2030? I know you threw out that stat there. Most of the ships that are going to be on the sea are going to be carrying LNG as opposed to oil. But what does that look like if you drill down into the continent of North America specifically? You mentioned building export facilities in Canada. We're sitting in 2024, and now 6 years from now, is the BCF going to be increased? More export facilities in Canada? do you think that the United States is going to be able to get past any regulatory roadblocks to build export facilities on its west coast, maybe even its east coast, block
Yeah.
Mexico out of that equation a little bit? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's gonna, I mean, as of right now, the US is gonna be drastically increasing their expansion and to probably about 20, somewhere between 24 and 28 BCF a day by the year 2030. So that's going to be doubling. The amount of LNG exports coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, which is substantial. And
Yeah.
that is projects that are already under construction, have already got FERC approval. They don't need any extra government approval system. So
Yeah.
that's going to be huge. Again, putting in context that they're already the world's largest LNG exporter, and they're going to double the amount of export capacity that they've got in the next kind of 10 years. The same thing is in Canada. I mean, it's, there's 3 projects that are being built right now for LNG export. It's expected that there will be a couple more. Both an expansion of LNG Canada is expected, and also another project, a Salisma, which is formerly the Rockies LNG. So Canada's probably, hopefully, looking by 2030 at 6 or 7 BCF a day of LNG exports, which for Canada is very, very, that's over 30% of all the production we have today. So
Right.
that's a real big number. So I think, what we're seeing is that North America is taking a really prominent role here in this growth of natural gas. There's now going to be over 50 countries that can import LNG, and that number was around 23 just 15 years ago. So there is, I think from a geopolitical standpoint, North America is putting themselves in a very good position. People are looking for natural gas from sources other than the Middle East or Russia. And so Canada and the United States I think are going to be able to really exploit this opportunity.
Yeah, no, 100%. And another good dovetail into the next piece. So obviously there's a huge demand for this. And I think that was also a really good stat of who and what countries are building these import facilities, right? So that number is roughly doubled.
Yes.
Right. So that's fantastic. Now the what is it? The North Americans via the United States and Canada are building a lot of these export facilities. We're obviously ramping up production in both countries. Fantastic. What roadblocks, Phil, do you foresee, if any, in both the United States and Canada? Companies like yours in both countries, are focused and I think have a favorable backdrop to this. But what would stymie or stop this production from happening and from essentially getting out to the larger world and be able to meet that global demand?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest risk would probably be a governmental risk. If there was a shift in, for instance, President Biden had discussed putting a moratorium on LNG exports until kind of post 2030. So all this growth we're talking about, it wouldn't have impacted that, but it might have impacted the next leg of growth out of LNG. So depending who's in power in any one of these 3 countries, there could be a change in posture in the support for this industry. That would be one thing. I don't think we have a lot of natural gas, both Canada and the United States. The reserves are quite extensive. So I don't think it's an issue of not having the natural gas to supply this growth. I think it's more the ability to build the infrastructure. These are huge, very expensive projects. The Canada project was one of the biggest private enterprises, the construction projects in our country's history. It was, all told, was probably around 30-40 billion dollars. So, they're to get investment behind those types of consortiums that need to be put together, you want to make sure that you've got the support of the government. You're not going to have the rug pulled out from you after having spent that kind of investment. I think that's probably the biggest concern, the biggest risk. But both, like, they create a lot of jobs. They are helping the world get cleaner. I mean, there's about a 60% carbon reduction when you go from coal to natural gas. And we've seen this in the United States. We saw it in the province of Alberta. Province of Alberta where our country resides, used to be about 80% of our power came from coal. The very last coal facility shut down this year. So because of that, our carbon emissions have been reduced drastically, as we have in the United States. We talked about it at the beginning, but one stat that many people from the United States are not aware of is that natural gas is the single biggest source of electricity in the United States at 42%. Like, so all this electrification that's happening around vehicles and around the power demands around the data centers and all the, the energy demand that's growing, natural gas is going to play a really substantial part of the solution for that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's funny too. You mentioned, a lot of stats that folks don't know about. I think that's 100% true. Also very cyclical, right? So, when it gets really cold out, it doesn't matter. I mean, really mostly the United States or Canada, but you tend to turn on that nat gas usage.
We sure do in Canada.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And it's just funny because none of us really think, especially in Canada and North America, whenever you plug in your phone or switch on that light switch, what is the immense infrastructure that is behind that makes that possible, makes that happen. And so be able to explain these changing dynamics behind the scene, behind that flicking of the switch on or plugging of the phone in, essentially what's powering that, I think incredibly powerful, especially as you said, North America, Canada, the United States are taking a leading position to supply not only ourselves, I mean, that's great, fantastic too, but the rest of the world, if possible. And all this is, of course, for profit, right? We're not doing this just for free or whatever, but yeah, that's fantastic. So it sounds like mostly you foresee, Phil, any sort of government risk as a potential roadblock to companies like yourselves being able to meet this global demand, correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there will be other, the Middle East is going to build out their export capacity for natural gas as well. So, everybody, we're not the only countries that see the LNG demand growing globally. So there'll be other countries that, Russia. I mean, what's the role of Russia in future years as a natural gas exporter? I don't know. I mean, it depends on how the world, reacts. Presumably, this war that's been going on for 2 years comes to an end at some point, and does it then go back to a more normalized? I think the reality is that Russia today exports about the same amount of natural gas they always did. It's just going to different sources. I mean, or going to different users. So China and India are quite happy to continue to use natural gas wherever it's sourced from.
Exactly. No, I think that's something that a lot of folks don't hit on, right? It's just, look, if you're faced with either not using it or using it, folks are going to, essentially deindustrializing. Of course, you're going to choose to use any source of energy that you can get your hands on. LNG just tends to be that source of energy that you can get your hands on for most countries.
Agreed.
Now, I'm curious, let me go a bit off the reservation here, Phil. So, we're talking a bit on the global stage. What do the Qataris think of all this? They obviously see an explosion of production in Canada, the United States. Obviously, we're talking about any governmental risk. It seems like sometimes we like to shoot ourselves in the foot on that, but that's okay. But what, from your vantage point, what do they see? How are they viewing this increase in production?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have any direct insight other than they are growing their natural gas exports, and they will grow their LNG exports. So, the three biggest exporters of LNG have been the United States and Qatar and Australia. Australia seems to be a bit capped, right? They haven't had any new projects being grown, but Qatar has been very vocal that they will be growing their LNG exports. So that will be, another country that'll be competitive in this space. I think it's obvious that more natural gas is going to be needed, and LNG. A lot of big companies like Shell and BP have predicted that there's going to be an LNG shortage in the 2030s. So I think my own view is that North America is going to be in a really prime position to take advantage of this growing use of natural gas around the world. I mean, it is the fastest growing hydrocarbon that's used anywhere. And again, just a statistic that people may not fully appreciate. There's been this huge growth in renewables and wind, solar, geothermal. But the reality is that over 84% of all of the energy in the world still comes from hydrocarbons. And that's really coal, oil, and natural gas. And the only one that's growing rapidly is natural gas. Oil's still growing, but the pace is slowed. And coal is not growing, but yet, again, a statistic that many would maybe be surprised by is that coal had its biggest year ever last year. Coal is still the base load energy production in many, especially in Asia and developing nations.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Fantastic. And so, Phil, I think this is also a really good point you bring up. So we're talking obviously a lot on the global stage. We're talking about, regional items as it relates to the United States and Canada production in both of those, as well as any risks that, might affect or slow that production. So you talked a lot about this at Enercom in Denver, the conference that you and I met at. A lot of big macro dynamics we're talking about. Now,
Yeah.
this can a bit seem it's really cool. I think you and I are both nerds for this. We love this kind of stuff. I love the presentation. But how do these really big macro dynamics actually affect the individual companies in both Canada and the United States? I was again grateful enough to be in the conference and hear a bit about what y'all are doing at Pine Cliff. So I think you have really good insight and context into how this affects the individual, how these big dynamics and backdrops affect the individual companies in both of these countries.
Yeah, I mean, I I'm biased.
Right.
Running a natural, my Pine Cliff is about 80% of our production is natural gas. So we are a natural gas producer here in Western Canada. I believe that it's going to be a very good time to be a natural gas producer in the years coming up here. I think that this LNG, we've had no new LNG exports really in North America for a couple of years. So we talked about the growth in LNG exports in the United States, very impressive from 0 to 14 BCF a day. But then there was a bit of a plateau for the last 2 years. Well, that plateau is about to end. And so starting in the fourth quarter of this year, we've got as we talked about LNG Canada, we talked about the Mexico LNG. We also talked about the fact that the U.S. was going to be, well, that's the Golden Pass and the Calcasieu, and there's multiple LNG projects that are coming on. So I think all the natural gas producers are going to hopefully get the benefit of higher domestic natural gas prices. It's been 2 record warm winters here in the last 2 winters, and therefore natural gas storage is higher than it typically is. However, I'd point out that it can move very rapidly. I mean, so
Right.
I mentioned the natural gas prices being around that $2 marks in the U.S. They've been actually less than $1 here in Canada, but in 2022 we averaged $5 an MCF. So that was only 2
Fantastic.
years ago. Things can move quickly. So I think as an investor, I always tell people that if you don't have any natural gas exposure in your portfolio, you really should consider getting some here as we head into the winter of 2024-25.
Yeah, I think that would be incredibly smart for folks to take a look at for sure, and very easily. Now, Phil, also want to draw you out a little bit on a piece that you mentioned, right? So as we head towards 2030 and obviously beyond, you perhaps start to see a bit of a flipping of oil is still going to be there as a source of energy, but LNG is going to continue to grow. How does that affect, do you think, producers that are sitting here in the Permian, that are sitting in the Bakken in the United States? And for those that don't know, these are just different basins and reservoirs for oil and natural gas drilling. How does that affect those players, if at all? Maybe it's pretty marginal and that's not that much, but I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's going to be, it's interesting that right now the technical term is backwardation when a forward
Yeah,
price is less than the current price. That's what oil's at. So oil's at, today I don't know what oil prices are at today, but let's say it's
right,
$75. And so, but the forward price, what the market is expecting is that it's going to be in the 60s in the next couple of years. So they've got it going down. Whereas natural gas is what they call contango. So natural gas prices in 2025 are like $3. Whereas as we just discussed, they're
yep,
well below that today. So there's an optimism that we're going to see more natural gas demand. We're going to need more natural gas to meet that demand, and therefore to do that, you need to put there has to be a price that's going to make producers incented to go out and drill for the product. So it's going to be I suspect there's going to continue to be a lot of volatility. One of the big things that's really changing the narrative around this is this push to how much artificial intelligence and how much energy is going to be required in data centers being built all throughout North America. And
right,
North America is going to lead the way on this. And that's going to potentially impact natural gas in a large way. We talked about the LNG growth, but there's studies out there that are now talking about 7 to 8 BCF a day more natural gas demand just for the data centers by
Right.
2030. So, we're going to need a lot more energy. I think that's the bottom line. No matter where you are in the world, you need more energy. The world's not decreasing its demand, and where is it going to come from? And I think the one thing about the United States have done a tremendous job utilizing the shales that you mentioned, but there's a legitimate concern because that shale that it doesn't go on forever, and so do you start to see diminishing productivity out of Marcellus and out of the Haynesville and even the Permian, which has been a beast for oil production. And if that's the case, where else do we go? And that's one thing that Canada, because it's fairly early innings, as we say, in the Montney, in the Duvernay, some of the big shales up here, I think those plays might be asked to ramp up their production higher than they have been in the past here.
Yeah, and you brought up an interesting point on data centers and AI. This is something that we look at a lot specifically, for sure. So, as you mentioned, it requires an immense amount of energy to supply both the data centers and as well as the so-called the back end of AI, for lack of a better technical term, right? So these algorithms take huge amounts of energy, and I think we actually saw this just the other day. Microsoft or some other big tech company is building a 3-mile long or something personal nuclear reactor to power their own data centers, right? And so this is just the beginning. And not everybody's a Microsoft, and not everybody can afford that. That's obviously very expensive, takes a lot of technical know-how. So, if you're left in the lurch and you're a company that is not of big a market cap as Microsoft, what do? You're probably going to have to turn to some other form of energy. That form of energy is probably going to be, especially in the future, LNG.
Yeah, natural gas is still going to play a huge role. And one of the advantages, because of the natural gas reserves that we have in North America, is that we're seeing a lot of this reshoring. We're seeing it's becoming too expensive in many industries to have their operations outside of North America. So they're moving their operations. Fertilizer, smelters, aluminum, all of these require a tremendous amount of natural gas. And another statistic for your listeners is that hydrogen is discussed as a potential solution on many fronts. 95% of all hydrogen in the world is made from natural gas. So natural gas is a building block for a lot of the energy, and so the future for natural gas looks extremely, extremely bright.
Yeah, no, 100%. I could not agree more with you, Phil. So we could probably go on for the rest of the morning here. You are in fact a CEO. You've got a company to run, so I do not want to take up your entire morning. But again, really do want to thank you. So before we hop, Phil, what is new at Pine Cliff? Where can folks find y'all? And what can people expect from you guys in the future?
Yeah, the Pine Cliffs, we started 13 years ago. I was employee number one. We've grown from 100 barrels a day of production to close to 24,000 barrels a day of production, mainly by acquisition. We've done an acquisition here in December last year. There's more information. You can hear me talk about Pine Cliff and about many of the topics we touched on today in natural gas. If you go to our website, there's a whole bunch of past presentations I've given, and I also do a quarterly email that I would encourage people to sign up for. And again, it's to talk about the macro. I don't think a lot of the average investor doesn't fully appreciate just how big a role natural gas is going to play in the energy going forward. So I appreciate, Garrett, the invitation today to talk natural gas. As I would agree with your characterization, I consider myself a geek on this stuff, and so it's always fun to talk about it.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Phil, thank you again so much. We'll link that newsletter and everything else, the website below, just so everybody has easy access to it. But absolutely highly encourage everybody to subscribe to Phil's CEO executive newsletter. It's fantastic. Phil, thank you again. Very much appreciate the time this morning. Definitely stay in touch. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Garrett.